Welcome to the Facing Your Fears podcast, where we talk about facing the fears we encounter in education as teachers, students, administrators, parents, and coaches while finding our inner confidence to thrive. I'm your host, Amanda Alford, and today my guest is Matt Miller. Matt is from Rockville, Indiana. He is most commonly known for the author of Ditch That Textbook and also Ditch That Homework, two fabulous books. So if you haven't read those, I definitely suggest that for your summer reading list. He is the co-host of a podcast, Google Teacher Tribe, with Casey Bell, who is also somebody fabulous that if you're not following her on Twitter, she has great resources about Google. Matt is a Google innovator, a speaker, blogger, and just kind of overall Twitter celebrity. Like, I'm just going to throw that out. Like, you are known on Twitter. If you don't follow Matt on Twitter, his handle is at @JMattMiller, all one word. He also has a website, ditchthattextbook.com, and that's all one word. And you can follow all of Matt's blogs, all of his resources. And if nothing else, there is Ditch That Textbook Digital Summit, which always comes out in the winter, and you'll start seeing the hashtag Ditch Summit. And it is an online PD throughout the winter that I love to binge watch, kind of like Netflix over Christmas break. So that's kind of my Netflix during Christmas is Ditch That Summit. So Matt, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you having me on the show.
Yes, wonderful. So first, for those of you who maybe don't know what Ditch That Textbook is, or as I said that, you're like, why would somebody want to ditch the textbook or ditch the homework? Can you kind of give us a brief rundown of, what's the inspiration behind that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of times whenever I talk to people about this, they assume that I think that textbooks are evil, just like in and of themselves, which isn't exactly the case. It's kind of the idea that I think that we can do better these days with all of the resources and all that we know about teaching. We can do better these days than marching chapter by chapter through a textbook and doing the discussion questions and the worksheets and the workbook pages and, just kind of mindlessly marching through our day like that. When there are, technology tools, and we've learned a lot about how the brain works and how we can improve our teaching through that, and all of these cool student engagement opportunities. There's a lot that we have in our teacher toolbox these days. And if we just resort back to teaching directly from the textbook and just marching through it kind of mindlessly, I think that we're kind of shortchanging our kids. So, I quit using my textbooks in my high school Spanish classes years ago because I found that, surprise, surprise, they were not creating fluent speakers of Spanish in my Spanish classes. And so it's kind of been my passion since then to find new ideas, different ideas for teaching that are beyond just, kind of like doing that whole march chapter by chapter through the textbook. And so that's really what I love to do, is to share things that you can use through my blog and on Twitter and podcasts and the summit and all of that good stuff. So that's Ditch That Textbook in a nutshell.
And I am a firm believer, like if I could insert an animated GIF, it would be the girl with her hands up saying, amen, like amen.
Right. Yeah.
Because I did that. Actually, I read your book and I read Dave Burgess's book, Teach Like a Pirate. I read those the same summer. And I was like, that makes so much more sense. And I was like, I'm going to try it. What do I have to lose?
Right.
So, what am I going to do? Not give worksheets? Like not go through and have, them do the worksheets and stuff like that. So I'm like, I'm going to try it. And they loved it so much. I have a classroom set of textbooks in my room, and they work really well to help me with labs. Like they really work really well if I need to like raise or elevate something for a physics lab.
Yes.
They have great tools for that. And I do use them for resources. I do have them go back to the text and still try to find information. I don't make them completely obsolete, but they are not the core of my curriculum.
Yeah, that sounds like you're a textbook ditcher then, in my mind, And
I went through and I'm like, I'm going to try this. And I had such I had such a happier year for myself as a teacher. My students enjoyed it more. I love what Dave said in his book. Our students, would they be willing to come to your classroom if they didn't have to?
Yeah. Yep.
And
Exactly.
I was like, that is the attitude I'm going to take. And like I said, I realize it's important for them to go back into the text and find information, go back and find sources, find topics, find main ideas. But it's not the sole heart of the curriculum. There's so much more that you can do. I just loved when you came here last year and you were talking about that, and all just the ideas that were springing up. It was like all these little light bulbs going off going, I guess we can. Like nobody had ever said, you don't have to teach directly from the book. Like nobody had ever told them that. And so it was like all these new ideas springing up.
Yeah. And, that's the way it was with me too. Nobody, when I got my very first teaching job, they handed me the teacher's editions, they handed me my keys, and they said, here's your classroom. And so it's kind of understood, or at least we think that it's understood, that here are your textbooks. This is what you're supposed to do. And, I was in a smaller school where we didn't have prescribed curriculum. We didn't have anything we were supposed to do, step by step, but I did have the standards. And after several years of trying to teach by the textbook, I started to realize, there are different ways to meet those standards than going chapter by chapter through the textbook. If the goal is to understand that content and to develop those skills, you don't have to do that out of textbook activities. There's so much more that you can do. And if the goal is to reach those learning objectives, to reach those standards, instead of reach the last page of your textbook, there's a million different ways to do it. And I like, Amanda, what you said about sort of your own journey, in that you enjoyed teaching more when you quit trying to, just assign worksheets and just march through the information, because your personality starts to come out in it. Your creativity starts to show. It becomes kind of like an outlet. And I think that's sort of a side effect of doing this too, is that we become more validated as educators, and we feel like, kind of like we see ourselves in our lessons more when we do it that way.
Oh, I totally agree. And it's a great way to build relationships with your students. They see you as something more than just the person standing up there reading. They see you engaged. They start to make those connections. And that's what it is. Like classroom management is so much less of an issue when you have the relationships and they see you actively being part of the assignment. So when I'm up at my whiteboard or my Promethean board and we're doing a pair deck, I'm still standing up there, and they have so much more fun because we're still covering standards, we're still covering curriculum, but they have such a more active part in it. They get to draw, they get to do their flashcard factory. I get to see where they are because there's the thumbs up or the thumbs down or the smiley faces or the sad faces of how do you feel, and everybody has a voice. Every student gets a voice, and Pear Deck has that, and Flipgrid has that. And it's students that I would never hear from if I just gave worksheets. They would never ask for help. They would never raise their hand. They would silently struggle all year. And now through, like I said, Pear Deck and Flipgrid, and there's more. It doesn't just have to be technology based, but all these other activities, I can see and build these relationships. And talking about Ditch the Summit, last December, you had Ken Shelton on your show. Right. And he talked about the Google form, sending out the Google form every morning. How are you doing? How's your day? One scale of 1 to 10. What can I do to help? And I do that every day now.
It's so simple, isn't it? And I mean, it makes such sense.
It is. And they tell me, like, they don't, I was afraid when I first tried it that they would be like, kind of, sarcastic or, joking around, taking it not seriously because they're 12, 13, 14-year-old kids, and they don't. If they're having a bad day, they spell it all out for me.
Yeah.
And 90% of the time, I can't even, it's not things that I can control. They just want me to know why they're having a good day or a bad day. And then I can celebrate with them if they're having a great day. I can try to talk to them a little bit or send them to somebody that they can talk to if they're having a bad day, whether it be a counselor or a nurse. Or I can just walk over and say, you know what, I'm sorry that you had a bad morning at home, but what can I do right now to help you get through your day? And then the students who do silently struggle, they can tell me, I'm having a hard time understanding igneous rocks. I know you've gone over it all week, but I'm still having a hard time.
Right.
And they let me know, and they all have a voice. And I love that. That's still ditching that textbook. I'm not doing those morning worksheets of the daily oral language worksheets that, I remember doing. I'm still building connections, and I'm still ditching the textbook because I'm still reaching out.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Totally love that.
So, all right. So speaking of messages, I like to do whiteboard messages, which is something that I learned from Brittany Root. She is a 5th grade teacher in Illinois, and I follow her on Instagram, and her Instagram handle is Miss Fifth. And it's another way of building relationships. It's a way of reaching out. And for the students who don't necessarily want to come up and talk to me, they can write it up on the board. And I always like to joke that my fellow teacher, Amanda, she's the language arts teacher. So, of course, she keeps the poems and the quotes and the inspirational passages. And she has a really good turnout in her classroom. I'm a little sillier, so I like to ask the actual traditional 12, 13-year-old type questions. So I have 2 questions for you.
Okay.
Okay, the first one is, if you could go back in time, what time period or what year would you choose?
See, you gave me this question beforehand. I've kind of been like slowly, quietly agonizing about this ever since. Cause I thought, when I was a kid, I used to think that medieval times were so cool, with, like the knights and the castles and all of that stuff. So I kind of went there, and of course you could go all the way back to like prehistoric times and everything. But I kept coming back to something just as simple as going back to like the 1950s. And I think that's going to be my answer because, I feel like I was born in the 80s. So obviously I missed the 50s. I feel like that was just sort of like a time where things were fairly simple, traditional. I'm thinking like, we didn't have, I know it was a time before all of the technology, and I do love my technology, but I love to be able to disconnect from it. And, I don't know. I just sort of have this happy picture, I guess, in my mind of what life must have been like at that point. So that's the one that I'm going to stick with.
And I agree with you. I think it's one, I have a hard time choosing. So depending on what time of year I ask that question, I think my answer varies. Yeah. Because like right now it's Easter weekend while we're recording this. It's Good Friday. And so, how cool would it be to go back during the biblical time and see what that's like? Yeah. But then 2 weeks ago, I was on the Washington, D.C. trip with the 8th graders, and I'm wearing a Gettysburg sweatshirt. And, we went to Gettysburg, and I'm like, what would it have been like to be during the Civil War and actually see what we've always talked about in the history books? Because when we took our students there, it's like a light bulb clicked. They're like, this makes so much more sense now because they actually got to see it. And traditionally, I go back to New York around 1912 to 1915 because that is when the Industrial Revolution really started to take off.
Oh, nice. Good choice.
And so, because even though I'm a science teacher, my husband will tell you, I won't binge watch Netflix, but I will binge watch the History Channel like all day. Like I am a huge history buff. And so to see, the development of Harley Davidson, Ford, the vehicles, and what was it like as we transitioned over into modern transportation, as steel went into place with Carnegie, and what was it like when we started building out of steel. But I think most of all, I just want to see Babe Ruth play baseball.
Nice. Yeah.
I would just love to be there, like early years of Babe Ruth playing. How awesome would that be to see, the stands full and everybody? Because kind of like what you were saying in the 1950s, because I also would probably choose the 1950s because just of simplicity. And that's kind of in my mind. In the late teens, early 20s, we didn't have the Great Depression. Everything was booming. Everything was happy. People were getting, more prosperous. And so I would really love to see like what kind of the early Roaring 20s was like, and Babe Ruth.
Yeah.
All right. Second question. If you and your family could go anywhere in the world, where would you go?
This one was much easier for me. So we're definitely going to Western Europe. So, going to Spain and Italy and France and all of that. Being a world language teacher my whole career, I've studied a lot of the things in Spain that kind of make up its cultural roots. And so being able to see those and then to cross over, since you're so close to so many of those countries, being able to see several of them, throw Germany in there and all of that. There are all of those huge world landmarks that I would love to be able to see and take my family to see. So instead of picking some place that's warm that has a beach, which nothing wrong with that, I'll take that just about any day. That's probably the one place that I'd like to go on vacation.
And I totally agree. I would love to do Western Europe. I would love to do Ireland, England.
Yeah.
There.
Yeah, absolutely.
And like I said, the beach is nice. And I love warm weather. And so, but yeah, getting just again, kind of that history geek coming out of.
Yeah, me too.
What is all that historical culture that's still there, that you can walk and still see?
Yes.
All right. Well, switching gears, like I said, you mentioned that you were a world history teacher all of your teaching career. Now you are an author and a blogger and a speaker. So, kind of take us down the road of what your journey in education has been and kind of your why.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually didn't start in education. When I was in college, I was a journalism major. I thought for certain I was going to be a newspaper reporter or a newspaper editor. I was all about journalism, did the college publications, had internships in college. I did all of the things in college. Graduated, got my first newspaper job covering county government in central Indiana.
Hot topic.
Yes. And it was a hot topic, actually. I mean, there was a lot of stuff going on. There was some controversy. There was a little bit of malfeasance, and I hated it. Hated it. I mean, like, I probably would have had ulcers if I had stuck in this job. However, my wife was a middle school social studies teacher at the time. And I went on some of my days off, I would go in with her. Sometimes I would cover stories where I would need to go to schools. And for some reason, I just felt at home in schools. And I started looking into why I got into journalism in the first place, talking about my why. And the thing that really charged me up the most wasn't going out and covering the stories. It was working with other reporters to improve their writing. I started to realize, wait a second, that's as much teaching as it is journalism. And so that was the impetus for me to go back to school to get my teaching license and to start teaching. And so I got into Spanish because I had enjoyed Spanish when I was in school. It was something that I took as an elective just because I loved it. And I thought that's something that they teach in high school that I can teach. So I got into my first class of students before I even had my teaching license. I was on an emergency teaching permit. And so here I am.
Yes.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Nice. So here I am showing up to this school. I had been removed from the journalism world for just 8 months. So if a calendar year before, if you had said, hey, Matt, I know you're getting into this whole journalism thing, but in a year, you're going to be teaching high school Spanish, I would have thought, you are crazy. There is no way. So I get into my very first class of kids and I have no idea what I'm doing. I had not had a student teaching experience because I was student teaching in my own classroom. I'd never taught Spanish a day in my life. And I was just kind of making it up as I went. And like I was saying earlier, I taught very much out of the textbook for a little while. But I think my background in journalism and my background in not being, quote unquote, an education person made me feel like I didn't have to, not necessarily that I didn't have to follow the rules, but like I wasn't beholden to what everybody had done before. And so when things didn't work as well as I had hoped those first few years, I was willing to experiment. And I think that my communication skills through journalism really helped me to cut to the core of what I needed to show kids and what I needed to do. So we started doing lots of conversational Spanish. We started doing more technology stuff, where we would create things using Google Apps and using a variety of things. And the more I started doing that, the more I realized, A, the kids love it. B, it's getting results. And C, we are not using these textbooks very much. We started using them less and less and less until eventually one year I was like, I'm not handing these things out this year. And after that, I just started providing them with the minimum teaching materials that were similar to the things they would get out of the textbook. And then we would just practice them in a variety of different ways. And so I think that was really my why. My why was all about how can we teach foreign language in this case in a way that the kids love that's effective. I mean, I thought, for goodness sake, babies learn how to speak languages and they don't do verb conjugation drills. There has to be a better way to do this than what we're doing. There's got to be a more effective way. And so just through trial and error, I tried to find some things that would work. And not everything was super effective, but some things, again, through trial and error and different iterations, became better and better to the point that we did that instead of the textbook.
Well, and I love what you said about how with the babies, babies learn languages, multiple languages. Babies can be bilingual, trilingual,
yes.
And not a single textbook, worksheet, test, quiz, or anything is ever given to them. It's all practice. It's all doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had students make comments about that before because, being in middle school, by the time they get to me, some are very open to my ideas. And so I always tell my students and parents, my first 9 weeks is going to be a little challenging and hard for them because I'm basically kind of breaking the mold that they have been in for 7 years. For 7 years, it has been open your book, do a worksheet, take a test, repeat. And I'm like, I don't do that. Mm-hmm. And so it's a lot more independence. It's a lot more student-centered. And I always have students that at first grumble and they're like, why can't we just do a worksheet? And I'm like, really? Like, did that just come out of your mouth? But then I have to stop and think. That's all I know.
Yeah. And they're good at that version of school. They're good at playing that game of school where you collect points. And if they're good at it and they can get the grades and the grades keep mom and dad happy, they are familiar with that whole process. And it's not necessarily an effective process, but it's a means to an end. It's what they do to make mom and dad happy so that they don't get in trouble, so they don't get grounded, so they can still do the things that they want to do. Means to an end.
Exactly. And so my class is getting out of their comfort zone. And I slowly, kind of ease them into that because I don't want them to get frustrated. I don't want them to get upset. But I do tell them, I'm like, it's okay to struggle. Some of you are going to struggle, and that's called growing up. Like that's playing the game of just life. And so I've always had at least one student a year make the comment, well, do you think that when people started learning all this science stuff back in the day, they had worksheets? And it kind of like went right along with what you were saying. They're like, there wasn't worksheets 200 years ago, man, when Isaac Newton was figuring out his laws. Like he didn't get a textbook and start reading this. It was hands-on. It was learning. It was trial and error. So I really love what you were talking about. And you kind of hit on this a little bit, but, everybody has fears.
Mm-hmm.
And education, as educators, if you've been listening at all, I mean, this is, the name of the podcast is Facing Your Fears. What would you say are some of the most common fears in education right now?
Yeah, I think one of the big ones is to take control of your class and make it the way that you want it to make it. I think that we fear doing that. And I think it's maybe a fear of failure, a fear of trying something that's uncertain and having it blow up in your face or not having it get the results that you want, and just assuming that initial failure is failure, when in reality it's just, some people use the FAIL acronym, first attempt in learning. It's the first attempt to try to get it figured out. And I think that we're afraid to try some of those new ideas because we're not sure how it's going to go. I like to think of teaching a lot like the work of a carpenter. I like to do a little bit of woodworking in my garage. Sometimes, I've built a couple of things, and I love the process that a woodworker goes through. And I think it so mimics what teachers go through, because a woodworker will see something out in the world. They'll see it at a store, or maybe they will envision it in their mind and they'll think, I need that, or I need to build that because people will buy it or because people will use it. So really what it starts with is it starts with a dream. That's what their entire process starts with, is a dream, a picture of something that they want to create. And then they start to plan. Now, notice I didn't say they went and picked their favorite tool out of their toolbox.
Right.
And sometimes as teachers, we get this backwards. And we start to think, sometimes we look at the flashy digital tools and we think, how can I use that in class? Let's take, you were talking about Flipgrid earlier. Mm-hmm. I know lots of teachers that are excited about Flipgrid. And sometimes you think, oh, I can't wait to use this in class. How can I use this? I like to think of it as, that's a hammer. You put that hammer in your toolbox and you gather all of the tools that you can into your toolbox. But don't you touch your toolbox until your plans are set, Mm-hmm. So that's what the carpenter does, is the carpenter sits down and they craft a plan. They draw out what it's going to look like. They think of all the materials that they're going to need. And only when they've bought the materials and they're ready to start, do they grab that first tool. They've got in mind what tools they want to use, but they don't create the project based on wanting to use that shiny hammer that they just bought. So they've got the plans, and then they get to work. It's time to start cutting the wood. It's time to start drilling the holes. It's time to start putting the nails in. And the nice thing about the carpenter's approach is that sometimes they have to take a step back, change their plans. Sometimes they've got to go back a couple of steps. And sometimes they get in the middle of their project and they realize this is never, ever going to work in the real world. And so they have to scrap their plan and they have to start over. Mm-hmm. But in the end, if they stick to the plan and they stick to their dream, eventually they get a product. And then they can improve on that product by sanding it and by finishing it and all of that. And I think there's so much connection to the way that we ought to be planning lessons in that way. You think about planning those lessons and we make those first plans and then we put them into practice in class. That doesn't mean that that's the finished product. That's us putting it together, getting ready to sand it down and getting ready to stain it and getting ready to varnish it and to make it look really, really nice in the end. So I think that that's one of the biggest fears. I know this is kind of a long way around to identifying the fear. I think the fear is that we're going to cut a bunch of these boards and try to put them together and it's going to be ugly. Well, guess what? It is going to be ugly. And that's fine. And that's what wood putty is for. And that's what sandpaper is for. And that's what paint is for. We start out and we assemble it together as best as we can. We adjust as we go. Even the best carpenters have to make those adjustments on the fly. And in the end, after we have nurtured that thing and we have worked it and we have polished it, now we have something that looks good that will eventually work. And then years down the road, you might decide, I want to paint that. Or I want to put some hooks on it so that I can hang some things on it. It doesn't mean that it's ever a finished product. And so I think that our fear of failing and of making something that's not pretty is one of the biggest things, when we really ought to be looking at it like a carpenter, where they're going to make something, but it's not a finished product the first time that they put it together. I think we've got to continue to sand and polish and paint and rethink our lessons, so to speak.
And I really, really love how you put that into perspective, because it's so true. Like, we are so afraid of failing. We are so afraid of messing up in front of our students. And we want it to be that perfect, finished product every single time we deliver it. And it's not. Like, it can look beautiful on paper. You can draw it, you can design it, you can color it. And it is, the most beautiful thing, but that's not guaranteed what it's going to be in the classroom.
Right.
You can't control the environment. I can't control, how my students are going to behave when they come in every day, because I can't control their home environment. I can't control what happened on the bus or the walk to school, or, what's happening in their personal lives or even in the hallways. Yeah. And so I can have this beautiful lesson, already made, or this beautiful unit already made. And I have to be willing, like you said, as a carpenter, to sand a couple of edges down, because that's not the way it's going to roll that day. I have to be able to, move on the fly and be flexible and versatile, and all the while letting them know that it's okay. Yeah. Like, not losing my cool, because they're always watching. They are always watching. And You're realize that every class is a different personality. Yeah. And that's the biggest thing. I have 6 classes. I teach the same subject 5 times a day, and every single class is a different atmosphere. It's a different personality, and I present it a different way, because I've finally learned the personality of my classes. Yeah. And so I have to be able to be flexible and moldable, just kind of like a carpenter.
Yeah, it's like you've started to realize that each one of those classes is like a different board, and they've got knots in different spots, and the grain of the wood takes stain in a different way, so it looks kind of different, and like every piece is different. It's kind of like, anything that's handcrafted. That it's handcrafted when it doesn't look exactly like everything else. And that's the stuff that people love. They love to see that it was really made by a human being. There's a quote that ties so nicely into this. It's by a guy named Louis Nizer. And oh gosh, I haven't thought about this quote for a little while, so I'm probably going to butcher this. But he says, a person who creates something with their hands is a laborer. A person who creates something with their hands and their mind is a craftsman. But a person who creates something with their hands and their mind and their heart is an artist.
Yes.
And I think there's a lot of that goes into the work that we do as teachers.
And to go along with that, as we're talking about molding and shaping this beautiful piece of woodwork or art, we have 180 days to create this. And it's a journey. You're not going to create anything beautiful or sanded or stained. It is going to be rough cut all through August. Yeah. It's going to be rough cut through most of September. Like, there's a reason this is a journey. And that beautiful product really comes out in April and May. It takes all year for you to build this, because it takes you that long to get to know your students and earn the trust and the respect and the relationships. But also, you need to understand, as educators, all of us need to understand, we build a different piece every year. Yes. We are not a assembly line. We're
Right.
not building a rocking chair or this perfect model, beautiful picture frame year in and year out.
We're not putting together IKEA furniture, are we?
No, we are not. We definitely are not IKEA.
Right.
We are very much, Thomas Paine, Thomas Kirkland.
Right. Yep.
Along the way,
Mm-hmm.
and every year is different. And I think that's the biggest thing. I posted on Twitter this morning, and the most dangerous phrase in education is, we've always done it this way.
Yep. I've heard that before too. Yeah.
And it's because they think that every year in and out, we do the same thing. And we don't. You have to model to, yes, it's the same standards. It could be the same curriculum, but we have to model to our students. That's who we're here for. Nobody hired me to be here for my principal. I am here for the 120, the 130 students that are sent to me for 180 days to model for them and to be not only their teacher and their confidant, but also, somebody to lean onto, a counselor, a therapist, a coach, a friend, a nurse, a comedian, an entertainer, whoever I have to be that day to help them for the 55 minutes they have me.
So true. Yep.
So going on with that, what advice would you share? Because I think a lot of teachers, especially first-year teachers or even veteran teachers, because we switch positions all the time. You could be in 6th grade for 10 years and all of a sudden you're going to 8th grade or 2nd grade. And that's scary because now you've got a different toolbox. You're having to switch out some tools because all of this curriculum that you've built, now you've got to learn new standards and new curriculum and new behaviors because of the way they interact. So what would you give advice to share for those who are facing the fears that we just talked about?
Yeah. Okay. So I used the carpenter analogy earlier to describe the fear. So the advice, I'm going to change analogies completely on you. You ready for this?
That's perfect. Go for it.
Okay. So Amanda, did you ever watch Top Gun?
Yes.
Okay. Top Gun is one of my favorite movies. It's like a guilty pleasure of mine. Okay. And so Top Gun, of course, is all about naval aviators. In the U.S. Navy, you've got these fighter pilots, the best of the best, the top 1% get to go to Top Gun and learn advanced combat techniques for being in fighter jets. And the whole movie is based around one particular guy whose name happens to be Pete Mitchell. Do you remember what Pete Mitchell's call sign was in the movie Top Gun?
Was that Goose?
Now, Goose was his partner.
Okay, Maverick.
Maverick, yes.
Yeah, Maverick. I was going to say, I know there's Goose and Maverick.
Yes, that's right. Goose and Maverick, exactly. And so Maverick was a bit of a risk taker.
Yes.
When he was in one of his first combat operations in Top Gun, he was chasing one of his instructors in a simulation, and they went down too far, and he followed his instructor down too far when he wasn't supposed to, and it was dangerous. And he had this other technique that he used where he had a guy right behind him, and he pulled up on the stick and hit his brakes, and the guy flew right under him. It was something that nobody ever did. Iceman was his nemesis in this movie, and he comes up to him and gets like face to face, nose to nose with him, and he says, "You are dangerous." And so Maverick was kind of dangerous, but it got results. His superiors at the flight school could see that he had this creative, improvisational way of flying, and sometimes it didn't turn out the way that he wanted, but a lot of times it worked. And it was because he was doing things differently. I tell you all of this, and I tell your listeners all of this, because I think we need a little bit more Maverick in our classrooms.
Yes.
I think we need teachers who are willing to be Maverick teachers. The ones who are willing to do a little bit of bucking the status quo and to experiment in class. The ones that are willing to try something where they're not sure how it's going to turn out, but it has the upside and it's worth trying because the kids might absolutely love it. And so That's my big advice, is that maybe the fears that we have of trying something new aren't all that we think that they are. Maybe they're more built up in our minds. And also sometimes when we try these new things that have a lot of potential to engage kids in the classroom, we try them and they end up producing results. And we might not be able to tie it back to a research study that told us that. And we might not be able to tie it back to another teacher in our building that's doing that exact same thing, and we know that it's going to work. There are not very many sure things in education. It's just like what we were talking about with every single class being totally different. But if we're willing to try those things, and if we're willing to meet our kids where they are and take their unique interests into mind and to create some of those things, it feels like we're taking a risk. But I don't think that doing some of those new ideas is that much of a risk after all. Sometimes we think of it as risky because we feel uncomfortable and we're trying something new. You know what I think is really risky? I think what's really risky is continuing to do those same things that we've done year in and year out that don't get results.
Amen.
We continue to do those over and over again. And by golly, I think that is a risk. And if we're not willing to try something, then we're putting ourselves into that risky environment. So maybe in the end, maybe our Maverick teachers, the ones that are willing to take those quote unquote risks, maybe that's not risky. Maybe that's the safest thing that those teachers can do, is to try something. So that's my advice. Go out on a limb and try something, because maybe it's not as risky as you think that it is.
Exactly, because it's like you always hear teachers say, well, what if it doesn't work?
Right.
And the answer should be, but what if it does?
Yeah. That's right. It's like that quote. There's a quote by, or a short poem by Aaron Hansen. And it says something to the effect of, your dreams are waiting for you on the wings of the sky, or something like that. And you ask, what if I fail? Oh, but my darling, what if you fly?
Exactly.
It goes something like that. And I think that's so true in so many avenues of education and in our lives in general.
Because I had a personal experience with that, and I'm kind of more upfront. I'm a little bit more blunt and honest and sarcastic at times, and I'm trying to encourage a teacher to take a risk. Just try this. And I think it was Cahoots.
Oh, yeah.
A great online activity. The students love it, and it's pretty user friendly and easy to use. And I was telling her, I was like, it's kind of fail proof. Like, as long as you hit the button, the only thing that's gonna fail is Wi-Fi. As long as we've got Wi-Fi, you're good. And her comment was, kind of along the lines of, well, what if it doesn't? What if it doesn't work? What if they don't get it? What if I screw up? And I'm like, well, do you only teach adverbs once? Do they get it 100% when you teach adverbs that one day?
Right.
Like, no. And I'm like, that's right. Even if it fails, you learn and you redo it and you do it again, because it's important for them to know what an adverb is. Mm-hmm. And she didn't take it very well. I probably could have worded it a little more. That is probably one of the biggest things I need to work on, is not being so blunt about it, because I'm like, well, what if it does?
Yeah.
Don't make the excuse, just try it, because I'm guaranteed that nobody in your class gets 100% on every single assignment, or even a assignment.
Mm-hmm.
There's
You're right.
A worksheet, quiz, test, because if they did, how easy was it?
Right. That's true. Amanda, I think as teachers, but just as humans in general, we have such an addiction to certainty.
Yes.
We are addicted to knowing what's going to happen and knowing exactly how it's going to happen. And I don't think that we give ourselves credit for our ability to improvise. Now, having a plan, it's like that famous, I think it was Eisenhower who said, failing to plan is planning to fail. Mm-hmm. And I think that we do need to have plans and we need to have things set out as best as we can, but we don't give ourselves credit for our creative capacities and our ability to improvise in case something doesn't quite go right. Because sometimes, I bet you've had the same experience. Some of my best classes and some of my best activities have come when something blew up and I had to improvise and go to plan B, or I had to invent plan B on the fly. Great things can come out of that. And I think that we have to give ourselves permission to put ourselves in a position to have to use our plan B.
Exactly. Because I use my whiteboard, here in our little town, the Wi-Fi is sometimes a little iffy, in and out, a little hinky, you could call it.
Sure.
And we used to joke because we saw this meme that said, I'm just a teacher standing in front of my whiteboard praying that the internet doesn't go out. Because they said, because what if it does? I'm like, then you improvise.
So what if it does? Yeah, exactly.
Then improvise. I'm like, and in my mind, teachers should be some of the most fearless individuals because we constantly have to improvise.
Yeah, you're right.
Alarm. What if there's a convocation? What if the Wi-Fi goes out? What if a new kid moves in? What if, something, you suddenly have a parent plan, or, a kid gets sick, or the copy machine fails. Heaven forbid the copy machine jams.
Right. Yeah.
I'm like, what do you do?
Right.
We constantly have to improvise and be on the fly. And I find that teachers sometimes are the ones who are the least likely to take the risk because they want that certainty.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Totally agree.
Well, thank you, Matt, so much for joining me today. And thank you all for listening to the Facing Your Fears podcast. If you like my show and want to know more, you can follow me on Twitter. My handle is @Alford_science. You can find all of my podcasts on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, and YouTube. Please leave me a review and make sure to subscribe to my podcast. Join me next Sunday for the newest episode of Facing Your Fears. And as the great Red Green always used to say, I'm pulling for you. We're all in this together. See you next week.